Greetings, County Historians, and welcome to our training module on handling difficult topics. I'm Jeannette Rooney. I'm the Assistant Director for Local History Services at the Indiana Historical Society. I think I know all of you, but it's good to have that reminder. And I'll be talking briefly about diversity and inclusion and implicit bias. And then I'm going to turn it over to Tamara Hemmerlein. So Tamara, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Tamara Hemmerlein. I'm the Director of Local History Services at the Indiana Historical Society. And I want to welcome you to the training on difficult history.
Okay, so I'm going to start off by talking for just a minute about diversity and inclusion. So there are a lot of different definitions for these. It's kind of a moving target, but these are some common factors that you'll find in different definitions. And I've included a couple of links at the bottom as well, both of which served as the basis for part of the discussion. So diversity can be said to be the unique attributes, characteristics, identities, and perspectives that make each person who they are. Inclusion involves the intentional efforts that ensure that individuals feel valued, heard, respected, welcomed, and engaged within a group. So these two are often linked, but they function differently. So think of diversity as a noun, a state of being, while inclusion is a verb. It involves action on our part. So it's important to consider these as historians because broadening inclusion of diverse voices in history is really critical to the relevance of history today. So how do you start to broaden this in your work? I want to touch on just a few considerations for increasing inclusion in history practices. First, think about the history you share and consider whether it's reflective of the diverse history of your community. We should also be working actively to counter stereotypes. And one important way to do this is through sharing a broader and more inclusive history. And then language can be very powerful. Consider the context for words that may be insensitive. Sometimes a word or a phrase may be something that's used in the context of reading a historical document, but might not be appropriate or even be hurtful to use in a discussion. It's also important to work to build trust within your community. Sometimes there may be a long history of divides, and it takes time to build relationships and trust. Now, as county historian, this is not on all on your shoulders, but maybe you can play a role with local history organizations to help bridge any of those past divides, or work to tell stories that might bring people together. So that also ties into considering multiple perspectives. There's very rarely just one side to any story, and in fact, there are often many different people with different roles and backgrounds that have a part in any historical narrative. So here are a few ways to engage these multiple perspectives and ensure representation and diversity and inclusion in local history. First, when doing history research or writing history narratives, whether in a publication, a blog, on social media, consider elevating the stories of people who have been traditionally marginalized or underrepresented. And you can also co-author works to give people ownership over their own stories. So invite, encourage, and share community-generated content. And then you know your county history best. You can advocate for the preservation of places and stories that really need to be told. Next slide. So one other aspect I want to touch on for a minute is implicit bias or unconscious bias. This is something that happens because a part of our brain is hardwired to organize and categorize information subconsciously without our awareness, taking in information and forming fast conclusions. It starts in the part of our brain that scientists have associated with emotional learning and fear conditioning. This processes billions of stimuli per day, and our brains have to really quickly choose what to focus on. This information is used for survival, to make inferences or categorize, and to feel emotions that attract us to certain people. Because this part of our brain must process billions of stimuli, or our conscious brain doesn't have the opportunity to interpret everything that we see. So what happens is this part of our brain works with other parts of the brain that link memories and process data to make these unconscious decisions based on personal experiences, social conditioning, patterns, etc. Then what this can produce is quick unconscious judgments of people and situations based on things like gender, skin color, weight, age, disability, religion, and on and on. The thing is, these unconscious biases don't often coincide with what we think or believe on the conscious level. So having these unconscious biases does not mean that we're consciously stereotyping or prone to act in a certain way. But it's important to be aware of them so we can start to take steps to consciously not act on them. We can never get rid of these implicit biases because they're hardwired into our brains. But there are some things that we can do to help counteract our unconscious biases. First, focus on seeing people as individuals rather than focusing on stereotypes to define people. Spend some time considering them on a more personal, individual level. We can adjust our perspective. Try seeing things from another person's point of view. How would you respond if you were in the same situation? What factors might contribute to how a person acts in a particular setting or situation? And work on consciously changing your stereotypes. If you do recognize your response to a person might be rooted in these biases or stereotypes, then make an effort to consciously adjust your response. So that's a quick overview of diversity and inclusion and implicit bias. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tamara Hemmerlein to talk about handling difficult history. Tamara, you're muted.
Thanks, Jeannette. And I want to start out by saying that a lot of what I'm going to talk about comes from a book called Interpreting Difficult History at Museums. It's by Julia Rose. And she started talking a lot about and thinking a lot about and developing ways for us as organizations and as individuals in the history field to talk about difficult history. And I'm also going to tie in a lot of what I say with diversity and inclusion. So some of what Jeannette said, you'll hear echoed in what I'm going to say about talking to folks and interpreting and dealing with difficult history. I want to start out with a quote from the president and CEO of the Indiana Historical Society, Jody Blankenship. He gets a lot of requests from folks for comments about history and how we talk about history, especially in moments of great change or great upheaval. And so this quote is in response to questions that he has gotten about the Indiana Historical Society and how it views current history and some of the harder aspects of what is happening now. So Jody says, history is critically important. It has the power to unite us in our ongoing desire to build a better future. By listening, learning, and striving to understand, we'll continue to hold conversations about our history and how that history has shaped our current world. Without change, our state, nation, and society will not be able to overcome the weight of its own violent and racist history. That is something important to keep in mind. A lot of what Jody has said in that statement, it's about listening, it's about learning, trying to understand, it's about talking to each other. And so that is a really important thing to think about, or a basis for understanding how you as county historians can handle questions about difficult history or tackling difficult histories in your own communities. So difficult history addresses issues of social injustice, oppression, and violence. And that's sort of how we view it in the history world. all kinds of history can be difficult. Some history that on the surface doesn't seem like it may be difficult, as you do research, as you talk to people, you may dig down and find out that yes, there's a lot of difficult history there embedded in a history that on the surface seems sort of free from those three things: social injustice, oppression, or violence. Remember that specific examples of difficult history may vary from community to community. So you may have aspects of difficult history in the African American history of your community, in Native American history, in Latino or immigrant history, LGBTQ history. Those are all some common areas where you find difficult history, and we are working to increase our ability to really include those stories and those voices as we talk about history. An important thing to recognize is that talking about difficult history is inherently uncomfortable. What you're doing is you're asking people to question what they already know and what they have learned, in some cases for their entire lives. It's not asking people to revise history. It's asking people to look at different aspects of the history, to bring in different perspectives, and to work within a history that can make them uncomfortable. Very often what you'll find is that people are shocked or surprised, or they are resistant to learning aspects of difficult history. So, for example, when the Native Americans were removed from Indiana, and there were, people would say things like they removed themselves, they chose to leave. In talking more about that history and delving more into that history and talking to descendants of the Native American community that was removed from Indiana, what you may find and what you will find is that they will say, it wasn't a choice, we were forced to leave. So if someone has spent a lot of time learning and has heard Native Americans chose to leave Indiana, and you, as a historian, you say they were made to leave, this was not a decision, folks may be resistant to that. It is asking them to question what they know or what they have learned and know that they know. So going into talking about difficult history, just recognize that. Also, it requires a different kind of listening and understanding on the part of both the person who is talking about the history and the person who is listening to those stories. So know that you're asking of yourself and of your audience to listen differently and to come to a different kind of understanding about what they're learning and what you are saying. And it does often bring negative feelings to the surface. Again, it goes to that idea that people may be uncomfortable because their existing knowledge is being questioned, or in some cases, their core beliefs are being brought into question. So one of the things that Julia Rose talks about in her book is something called commemorative museum pedagogy. And she has worked a lot and studied a lot and done studies about both how people communicate history and how people hear history. And she says very often there are stages that people go through when they are first hearing about or researching or talking about difficult history. The first one is reception, so that they are hearing it. Maybe the first time that they're hearing something about a particular aspect of history that is negative when they haven't ever heard it before. And then very often what happens is they are resistant to it. They think, no, this can't be what happened. I've never heard this before. And then they may actually say to you, if you say the Native Americans in Indiana were forced to leave, they may sort of repeat your words back to you. Forced to leave? What? Or they sort of repeat the story back to you in a way that is helping them kind of understand it a little better, or start to grasp what is going on with the story and why it's different from what they've known. Very often then people will start to think about it. It may not be then during your presentation or when they're reading an article or standing in front of an exhibit, but they'll think about it. And that thought process may lead to a reconsideration. It may lead to them saying, you know something, this I don't like it, and it's uncomfortable and it is hard, but I can see that, you know, this was something that happened. So when you think about it, that kind of reception, resistance, repetition, reflection, and reconsideration are all sort of stages that you as a researcher and historian and your audience may go through when they are first learning about difficult aspects of history. At the Indiana Historical Society, as things changed rapidly in 2020 and the situation was always in flux, we started to think about what sort of collecting initiatives we could have, that we could implement, that would help us tell a fuller story, tell more of the story. And each of these collecting initiatives has aspects of difficult history in them. One of our collecting initiatives, Telling Your Story, Documenting COVID-19 in Indiana, on the surface may seem like a very straightforward kind of collecting initiative. We're asking people for images and stories and what it's like to live in Indiana during a pandemic in 2020. When we first started this initiative, it seemed more straightforward than perhaps it will become, because part of this history, part of documenting COVID-19 in Indiana, is dealing with some difficult history. Protests around mask wearing, protests around lockdowns, things, how the pandemic has affected different communities within Indiana. So those are things that in this collecting initiative that maybe on the surface doesn't seem like it would have a lot of difficult history, it will actually end up having quite a bit of difficult history, perhaps, that the Indiana Historical Society will need to be aware of and work with as we continue collecting, and then as we begin using those collections to tell the story of Indiana during a pandemic in 2020. The second collecting initiative for 2020 is Project Take a Stand, Listening to the Voices of Protest. This is one of those initiatives that really, right there, right at the beginning, tells you that we are going to talk about difficult history. We're going to collect difficult history. We're going to learn how to interpret it, and we are going to make it part of our collection. When we start telling these stories, when we start making, perhaps in the future, exhibits and things based on what is happening now in 2020 in terms of protests, we're going to have to work through that difficult history as an organization. We're going to have to, as staff of that organization, the historians who are working to tell the stories, but also we're going to have to think about how our audience is going to hear these stories, and we are going to have to think about making sure that all of the voices are represented in our collection. We need to look at diversity and inclusion and make sure that that is part of these collecting initiatives. So as county historians, when you are thinking about your community and difficult history in your community, one of the first things to know is, or to think about, to make sure that you do, is to acknowledge that history in your community is not simple or one-sided. That there are all sorts of perspectives, that not everyone experiences a moment in history in exactly the same way. Something that may feel very comfortable and positive to one person may feel very much different to another person. And I would say this is where also, as a county historian, really think about the biases that you bring to the stories you're researching and the stories you're telling. What are you bringing to the table? What are those implicit biases that Jeannette talked about? Where has that hardwiring affected you and the way that you view a particular story in your community? Make sure that you research as many perspectives as possible with every story. Think about all of the viewpoints. Think about how that story, that history, touched different communities within your larger community. Always look for primary sources. If you're looking at distant history, look for those written sources that are primary sources. If you're talking about current history, or if you're laying the groundwork, if you're collecting current history with an eye to future county historians being able to use your work, talk to people who are there now, who are experiencing the history. And don't just stay with people or communities you know or are familiar with or most comfortable with. Look for individuals from communities that you may not have a lot of contact with. In your community, you may not have a lot of contact with a Latino community or an immigrant community, but they are in your community now. They are living the history you're living, but their perspective is different from yours. So make sure that you reach out to as many people as possible. Provide solid historical evidence. Look for facts, look for perspectives, do research, and as you're doing research and as you are providing this historical evidence, always keep in mind what you're bringing to the table or what you may be bringing to the table in terms of your implicit bias. You know, really sort of push yourself to reach beyond what's comfortable to collect as much good, solid historical evidence as you can. Remember to participate in community conversations because you're the county historian and people will look to you to have knowledge they don't have. And in these community conversations, they'll also be looking to you to provide knowledge of the past. At the Indiana Historical Society, we have gotten a lot of requests about 1918 and what the flu pandemic in 1918 looked like. What did people do? What did the government do? And we're getting those requests from all over the place, from regular citizens, from historians, from folks involved with government entities. They are looking to the past to give them guidance for the future. So as a county historian, really think about that when you are collecting history in your community, is at some point, 50 years down the line or 100 years down the line, another county historian will need to know what was going on. So make sure that you're participating in community conversations, make sure that you're gathering information from as many different people and communities as you can now, and make sure that you are creating a record that the future county historian can use. As you're doing this, as you're reaching out, as you're researching different perspectives and doing all of the things on this list and the things that you do as county historians, keep in mind that you should also be encouraging open, civil, and honest discourse. That that a lot of discussions are not going to be comfortable right now. But as a county historian, you can be there and you can encourage people to have good discussions that are civil discussions that can lead to real conversation, that not everyone may agree or needs to agree, but they should be able to have a conversation about things. And in those conversations, try to do what you can to facilitate a conversation that addresses both sides or all the sides of an issue, particularly with difficult history. You know, earlier I said a history that is comfortable to some people may be very uncomfortable for others. Those are both important parts of any conversation you're having in your community. So encourage discussion and discourse, and do what you can to keep that discourse civil and open. So as county historians, you are representatives of the Indiana Historical Society and the Indiana Historical Bureau. And sometimes when there's difficult history in a community, it can be very, very difficult if you're living in that community to think about when you need to separate yourself as a private citizen and when you are acting as an official county historian. So be sure in any situation you're going into that deals with history, preservation, because sometimes preservation issues, a lot of those things that we say are hot button issues, if you drill down, there are aspects of difficult history in them. Recognize when you're acting as an official county historian versus when you're acting as a private citizen. Be able to recognize that sort of internally in your own mind and take that into the situation with you. Be very aware of when you are one versus when you are the other. During the meeting, in the article, in the interview, whatever the interaction is, be sure that you acknowledge the difference in your response. You know, make it clear what role you are taking. You're a county historian, you know, when you answer the question, or in this particular case, you are a private citizen. Because when you are acting as an official county historian, due to the fact that you are appointed, jointly appointed by the Indiana Historical Society and the Indiana Historical Bureau, people are going to hear what you say. It's going to carry some weight because two important historical organizations in Indiana have appointed you, and they are going, people may look at you and they may then say, as county historian, what you say kind of is a higher level of importance maybe than what other people may say. They may perceive that what you're saying is actually coming from the Indiana Historical Society and the Indiana Historical Bureau. So just be aware and recognize when you're representing IHS and IHB as a county historian. Focus on being open to civil conversations. We're all people, as Jeannette said, we all bring our implicit biases. We all have things that are uncomfortable. We all have things that are hard. And so when you're a county historian, well, by virtue of being a county historian, that doesn't separate you from those normal person feelings. So really think about how you can be open to civil conversations, even if they're touching a nerve. Know what your implicit biases are, work to acknowledge and overcome them, work to change stereotypes you hold, and that will help you be more open to civil conversations, and will help you as you work to move a conversation forward in a productive way. In a way that really can affect real change in your community for everyone. And then remember to act as a mediator and a facilitator when it's appropriate for you to do that. Going back to what I said earlier, as county historians, you have a lot of knowledge. You carry the history of your community. You know where to find the history. You spend a lot of time involved in the history world. So people are going to ask you, and they're going to ask for your advice, and they're going to ask you for your knowledge. And very often when that happens, you're also in a position where you can look at a conversation that's happening in your community, and you realize that you have a role as a mediator and facilitator for that conversation when it's appropriate for you to do that as the county historian. So be willing to take that on if you can, and if you're comfortable doing that. So that leads to the idea of how to de-escalate tense situations. Because not everyone will have had the opportunity to really sort of think about their biases or think about what they're bringing to a conversation. So if you are asked to mediate or facilitate a situation, or if you're asked, hey, you're the county historian, what do you think? Or can you come to this meeting and tell us what you think? Think about what potential conflicts may happen prior to entering the situation. So sort of sit down and give some thought to where the hot buttons are, to in your community, where the tension is, where the stress points are, and come up with some plan for helping solve those conflicts, or helping at least move conversation forward about those conflicts. Be able to recognize the signs that a situation is becoming tense and may escalate. People may start shouting. People who were sitting down may stand up. Movements, arm movements may get bigger. They may get smaller. You know, people may start crossing their arms and hiding their hands, and, you know, or rocking back and forth, shifting their feet, waving their hands, and they were pointing at other people. Recognize those things, because all of those are indicators that tension is growing. Also be aware of changes in topic focus. So maybe you're going into a meeting and you're talking about a reuse of a downtown building, and everything is going fine. And then all of a sudden, somebody starts talking about absentee landlords and economic development, and really sort of talking about those things in a way that is starting to flash that danger sign at you. So listen for changes in topic focus, something that goes from sort of maybe being a more straightforward conversation to a conversation that is pushing everybody's buttons. And then have a plan for de-escalating conflict. What are you going to do? How can you redirect people? Is there a point in time where, if you're a moderator or a facilitator, you say to someone or to the group, I think we all need a break? Or sometimes what a facilitator will do is will say, you know something, I need a break. I need to go get a drink of water, or I need to use the restroom or something like that, to give people a chance to sort of separate a little bit and breathe. So here are some techniques for de-escalation. Take time to calm yourself. If you are the moderator or facilitator, or at any level of participating in the conversation, take time to calm yourself down. Take some deep breaths. Take that water fountain break, or water bottle break. Take a bathroom break. Walk outside to clear your mind. Take deep breaths. If you can't move away from the situation, go ahead and take some time to take some deep breaths. If you can't leave the room, do what you can. Always be assessing the situation. Keep paying attention to body language, tones of voice, and topics. Make sure you're respecting others' personal space. So don't lean in close. Don't put your hand up. Don't shake your finger at someone. Keep people's personal space. Prior to the pandemic, most Americans like 3 to 4 feet of personal space all the way around them. unless they know someone really well. Now, we're talking 6 feet. Some folks prefer 8 feet. So for a lot of reasons, respect personal space, because once you start moving in on that personal space, that may be seen by folks as aggression, even if you don't mean it to, even if you're trying to move in to hear better, or you're trying to lower your voice as a way to de-escalate the tension. Moving into someone's personal space can be read as aggression. Really listen to the other person's concerns. You may not agree with what they're saying. You may not like how they're saying what they're saying, but do your best to listen and let them know that you're listening. Do some things with your own body language that say, I'm listening to you, or tell them, I'm listening. You can mirror what they're saying. If somebody says something to you and it's aggressive, what you can do is you can say, so what I heard you say was, kind of mirror what they said. Say, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding. So this is what I heard you say. That gives them an opportunity to clarify, but that also says, I'm listening to you. And that can go a long way at calming people down, because a lot of times they're getting louder, our emotions are getting bigger, they're getting closer to you because they need you to acknowledge that they're being heard. Keep your body language and tone of voice neutral. I would say neutral to supportive. As I said, don't be the one who's like top to the hand. Shift the conversation to problem solving and steps forward. Sometimes when people get very upset, they spiral. And they spiral to things, to concerns or feelings or something that are outside of the scope of the conversation. Sometimes they become circular. And basically what they're doing is saying the same thing over and over again. They may be getting louder. They may be changing their stance. Try and break that cycle by shifting the conversation to problem solving. So this is what I'm understanding your concern is. Please let me know if I've got it. And now that we know what your concern is, what are some ways that we can look for a solution together? So really kind of wrap that listening and letting them know you're listening, clarification, and then wrap that into, now let's work together to solve the problem. Recognize when you've done all that you can in that situation and know when to step away and say, let me take a few steps back and let me think about this. You can say that. You can say, I need to look into that more. You can say, let me check with some other folks. It is okay to say, I am getting kind of tense right now and I need to take some deep breaths and I need to step away. But recognize when you have done what you can and step away. Also recognize that in some situations, if you are uncomfortable, if you feel unsafe, it is okay to say, I need to step away from this conversation. We can talk again at a later point. But it is always okay to step away. And then if it's gotten to that point, make sure that you contact the Indiana Historical Society and the Indiana Historical Bureau for guidance and help. We're here to help you. And if there is a situation that has become so tense or so uncomfortable that you feel the need to step away, go ahead and contact us. Ask what we can do to help. You are, as county historians, you are part of both the Indiana Historical Society and the Indiana Historical Bureau. You represent us out in the community, and we are here to support you in the ways that we can. And there may be situations where we could come into the conversation or into the situation or provide you with resources that help shift to the problem solving, that help folks see what the steps forward are when you're dealing with a tense situation or an aspect of difficult history. We are here to work with you and help you in whatever ways you need us to. So that is what I have for difficult history and de-escalation. Please contact us with questions that you may have. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jeannette.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. All of our contact information is here, and we hope you'll join the next couple of modules where the Indiana Historical Bureau will be going over some research and writing methodologies, a lot of handy tips with resources, how to use social media, all kinds of good stuff. So thank you so much for joining us for this module, and we look forward to talking